Hi everyone, good morning, and welcome again to another topic of teaching students with special needs. So for today, I am Bridget Masalta, your facilitator, and we are going to talk another topic under it. So, ayan. Now for today, we are going to talk about teaching students with intellectual disabilities. But before we go on with our formal discussion, let us talk first about the learning objectives I have prepared. Now, one of the learning objectives is to define what intellectual disabilities is. Second is identify the prevalence, characteristics, and assistive technology of students with intellectual disabilities. Third, discover classroom accommodation and modification in handling a student with intellectual disabilities. And lastly, evaluate the importance of teaching strategies. So without further ado, let us now tackle what is teaching students with intellectual disabilities. There. Now, an intellectual disability, formerly referred to as mental retardation, it is not an inherent trait of any individual, but instead is characterized by a combination of deficits in both cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior. The severity of the intellectual disability is determined by the discrepancy between the individual's capabilities in learning and in the expectations of the social environment. So it should be noted that while the term mental retardation is still widely used within education and government agencies, however, many advocacy groups feel that this label has too many negative connotations. So the newer terms of intellectual disability or developmental disability are becoming far more accepted and prevalent within the field. Now, talking about the characteristics, the large majority of individuals considered intellectually disabled are in the mild range with an IQ of 50 to 70. For many of these individuals, there is no specific known cause of their developmental delays. The validity and reliability of the IQ tests used with these individuals are often in question. However, if a student is evaluated and scores an IQ of 70 or lower, he or she is considered to have an intellectual disability. Now, the problems with these labels are not that the guidelines can be altered, as in the 1970s when eligibility guidelines shifted and thousands that were previously mentally retarded were miraculously cured by changing federal regulation. Now, the two characteristics shared in varying degrees by all individuals with intellectual disabilities are limitation in intellectual functioning and limitations in adaptive behavior. Limitations in intellectual functioning often includes difficulties with memory recall, task and skill generalization, and these students may demonstrate a tendency towards low motivation and learned helplessness. While issues in adaptive behavior may include difficulties with conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. Individuals with intellectual disabilities are often exhibit deficits in self-determination skills as well, including skills such as choice making, decision making, problem solving, and goal setting. Now, students labeled as mildly intellectually disabled demonstrate delays in cognitive, social, and adaptive behavior skills within typical classroom settings. Often, when they are in different settings, these same individuals function quietly capable both social and vocationally. In their adult lives, these individuals can be independent as well adjusted in the world outside of the school settings. It is only in the context of academic demands and intensive intellectual changes that their abilities appeared impaired. This type of school-based diagnosis has been referred to as 6-hour retardation, reflecting the time the student is actually in the classroom and appears to be academically impaired rather. So, the assertion that intellectual disabilities are a school-based diagnosis underlines the often arbitrary nature of eligibility requirements in the disability category for future adult services. Now, a label of the intellectual disabilities prior to age 18 is necessary for individuals to receive the specialized services beyond high school. Now, other characteristics of students with intellectual intellectual disabilities may vary depending on the cause. Now, there are numbers of common characteristics that may have a significant impact on individual learning, including the difficulty understanding new information, difficulties with communication and social skills, slow cognitive processing time, difficulty in sequential processing of information, and then difficulties in comprehending abstract concepts. Now, about with the assistive technology, the use of materials or actual tools in natural environment is very essential component in the effective instruction for students with intellectual disabilities, knowing that we are now in an online platform. Although these materials would be labeled as low-tech teaching resources, they serve, the both to motivate the student and facilitate generalization to multiple environments. Now, about an example of this type of technology would be the use of manipulative or the visual aids or the concrete objects. When you say math lesson or math subject, so teachers should keep in mind that students with intellectual disabilities in an inclusive classroom also benefit from using the same materials as the rest of the students whenever possible. So, in other words, a high school student would use a calculator to work math problems, whereas an elementary student may be, more likely to use counting blocks, such as the picture that I have presented on the screen. Now, there are a number of existing software packages designed to support students with intellectual disabilities in the classroom. One promising approach in literacy software utilizes a universal design for learning principles. Now, this approach combines reading for meaning with direct instruction for decoding and understanding. The resulting software consists of an audio and video-based curriculum that can be adjusted by the teacher to meet the specific academic capacities of the student. So ultimately, any learning software that can tailor tailor content to address the interests of the student can be useful in supporting learning with individuals, with individuals with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, given that the instruction can be adapted to meet the needs of the students. Now, how about the classroom accommodation? Now, once a child has been formally identified with a learning disability, the child or the parent may request accommodation for that child's specific needs. So, in IDEA, or Individual with Disabilities Education Act, they stated that a child's in their IEP or Individualized Education Program, or the team, which both parent and child are a part of, to decide which accommodation are appropriate for him or her. Any appropriate accommodation should be written also into the student's IEP. Now, I have categorized 6 possible accommodation for an IEP team to consider. Now, let's talk about the presentation. So, in presentation, the teachers should provide an audio tape, provide enlarged print, reduce the number of items per page or line, provide a designated reader, and then present instructions orally. So you don't have to depend always in written, but also be to verbalize your instructions. Second, response. Allow for verbal responses in both ends. Allow for answers to be dictated to a scribe. Allow the use of a tape recorder to capture responses. Permit responses to be given via computer, and permit answers to be recorded directly into their test booklet. Now, in timing, allow frequent breaks for the students and then extend allotted time for a test. So you have to give them a break. Next, setting. Provide preferential seating for the students, and then you have to provide also special lighting or acoustics, and then you have to provide a space with minimal distraction, because one of their characteristic also or behavior is that they are easily get distracted. So you have to keep it in mind that you have to provide a space with minimal distractions. Next is administer a test in a small group setting, and then administer a test in a private room or alternative test site. And you are going to use, the setting of an online class. And about the test scheduling, you have to administer a test in several time sessions or over several days, and then allow subtests to be taken in a different order, of course, and then administer a test at a specific time of the day. It's very important in putting that in your lesson plan. And lastly, in others, you have to provide special test preparation if needed. You have to provide on task or focusing prompts if necessary, and then provide any reasonable accommodation that a student needs that does not fit under the existing categories I have provided or mentioned earlier. Now, about the classroom modification. Now, children with intellectual disabilities or students with intellectual disabilities need some additional support and modification in their environment as well as in the type of activities they do. So we have here, or I have here, put some or few modification for students with intellectual disability that will help them to learn better. First, quiet workspace. So using this space only for studying will also help the child or the student to get into a routine of studying and also understand that when he or she is sitting there, he or she is supposed to concentrate on the activity or task and not to play. Second, functional activities. So teach practical things that will be useful in reality or in real world, such as how to boil an egg or how to find their way to their friend's house. Now, repetition for concepts over the day. So children with intellectual disabilities need to learn a concept in different ways and have the opportunity to practice it many times in order to learn and remember it. So you have to maintain rehearsals. And then teacher-student ratio. This children require additional support and guidance as they work on their activities. So ideally, there should be, at least one teacher for every 3 children or students with intellectual disabilities. And then hands-on learning. So using all the senses, the 5 senses, to learn, also help them learn and retain information better. So it is good if you will establish the complete sensory modalities when it comes to learning. And then safety measures, so you have to keep out of reach those objects such as knives, sharp scissors, and etc., and harmful liquids like cleaning liquids and then medicines. You have to keep them out of reach for those children. So in addition to that, make sure that none of the children can lock themselves up in any room, and small bits or other toy parts that children could put in their mouth should also be kept away. So if a children has a tendency to do that, so you have to do prevention. And then if the children has seizures, you may need to look at the padding, the corners of furniture to avoid injury. And then schedule. So the schedule must have short activity times and must alternate between physical and sitting down activities. So the schedule must also try to incorporate some aspects of self-care so that children becoming more independent in putting on or taking off the shoes, going to the toilet, or feeding themselves. And then with the teaching strategies, of course, to fully address the limitation in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior often experienced by individuals or students with intellectual disabilities, teachers need to provide direct instruction in a number of skill areas outside of the general curriculum. So these skills are more functional in nature but are absolutely essential for the future independence of the students. So additional skill areas include money concepts, time concepts, independent living skills, self-care and hygiene, community access, leisure activities, and vocational training. So students with intellectual disabilities learn these skills more effectively in the setting or activities in which they will be asked to apply these settings. So once the skills are mastered, the additional environment can be added to work towards generalization. So in general, curriculum areas should not be neglected, of course. However, there are many some promising practices to help support these students in a number of academic areas. And one of the technique is the early literacy strategy with the students is the prelinguistic milieu teaching. So it is a technique that ties instruction to the specific interests and abilities of the individual child or student. So this language acquisition Instructional strategy also helps support effective self-determination, as a component of the training is frequent requesting behavior from the students. So breaking down larger tasks into specific component parts can be an effective technique for teaching any skills or numbers of skills to students with intellectual disabilities. So more complex, concepts or activities can be taught over time as the student masters one component of the task and another is added to their routine after that. So this type of task analysis can be taught using a variety of instructional supports, from physical and verbal prompting to observational learning such as modeling. As well as always, the specific instructional strategies and materials used with the student can be or should be aligned to the specific students' interest and strengths. So useful strategies for teaching students with intellectual disabilities are not limited to. However, I just included 5 teaching strategies or following techniques in how to teach or in how to handle students with intellectual disabilities. So these are first, to teach one concept or activity component at a time, and then teach one step at a time to help support memorization and sequencing, as I have mentioned earlier in the classroom accommodation, and then teach students in small groups or one-on-one if possible. So aside from a large group discussion, it is also better to have small group or one-on-one with the students. And then always provide multiple opportunities to practice their skills, in a number of different settings. So again, as I've said, in the sensory modalities, you have to provide them multiple opportunities to discover their learning. And then use physical and verbal prompting to guide correct responses and provide specific verbal praises to reinforce these responses. So again, aside from written instruction, they also have to verbalize the instruction, and it is good if you will establish reinforcement to those students. But one of the reinforcement that is very effective is you will use the positive reinforcement. And then I guess that's it for the teaching students with intellectual disabilities. I hope that you have learned from it and you will instill all the learnings from this discussion. So again, it is Bree, your facilitator for today, and keep safe.